Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us and that you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
Today's reading is Zechariah 8, verses 1 through 13. The Lord Almighty gave this message to Zechariah. I have longed to help Jerusalem because of my deep love for her people, a love which has made me angry with her enemies. I will return to Jerusalem, my holy city, and live there. It will be known as the faithful city, and the hill of the Lord Almighty will be called the sacred hill. Once again, old men and women, so old that they use canes when they walk, will be sitting in the city squares, and the streets will again be full of boys and girls playing. This may seem impossible to those of the nation who are now left, but it's not impossible for me. I will rescue my people from the lands where they have been taken and will bring them back from east and west to live in Jerusalem. They will be my people, and I will be their God, ruling over them faithfully and justly. Have courage. You are now hearing the same words the prophets spoke at the time the foundation was being laid for building my temple. Before that time, no one could afford to hire either men or animals, and no one was safe from enemies. I turned people against one another, but now I am treating the survivors of this nation differently. They will plant their crops in peace. Their vines will bear grapes. The earth will produce crops, and there will be plenty of rain. I will give all these blessings to the people of my nation who survive, people of Judah and Israel. In the past, foreigners have cursed one another by saying, "May the same disasters fall on you that fell on Judah and Israel. But I will save you." And then those foreigners will say to one another, "May you receive the same blessings that came to Judah and Israel." So have courage and don't be afraid. May the Lord bless the reading and hearing of his word.
If I were to ask you who the best-selling artist of all time was, who would you guess? Maybe you think about, the greats, Picasso, Monet, Van Gogh, and perhaps if you're thinking about monetary value, you're on the right track. But if I wasn't talking about monetary value, but I was just speaking about sheer quantity of pictures sold, who's the best-selling artist of all time? A couple years ago, HarperCollins did the math. They did the calculations, and the answer was surprising. They said the best-selling artist of all time is a Swiss artist named Annie Valentin. Now, how did they arrive at that conclusion? Well, Annie was the illustrator of the Good News Translation Bible, which Heather read just a moment ago. I should point out that was Heather Walborn. She was reading on behalf of her daughter, Emmy. So Annie Valentin was the illustrator of the Good News Translation Bible, and she produced over 500 images inside the Good News Translation Bible. And the Good News Translation, which came out in the 70s, was one of the best-selling Bibles of all time, has sold over 225 million copies. And so you do the math, and that equals over 100 billion pieces of art that Annie has sold. And yes, I'm sure you can apply the same rationale to Peanuts or Garfield, and you'd say Charles Schultz or Jim Davis has a claim to that title. It's okay. But just go with HarperCollins for the moment and accept with me that Annie Valentin is the greatest best-selling artist of all time. Now, if you've never read the Good News Translation, you may have no idea what her pictures look like. So let me give you a couple samples. The thing about Annie Valentin is that she draws with simplicity. No color, no shading. Her objective was to use as few lines as possible in order to tell the story. And so often what she does is she draws stick figures like this. This is the feeding of the 5,000. And she captures the breadth and depth of the scene, and yet every single character is essentially a stick figure. Or consider this one. This is the shepherd looking for the lost sheep. I love this one because, have you spotted it yet? the sheep who's like a little Where's Waldo among all the bushes, how she's able to capture, just this scene with just nothing but line. Perhaps my favorite is this one, this depiction of Christ's crucifixion. 8 lines. That's all she drew, is 8 lines. And what's brilliant about it to me is the inversion that the head, the crown of thorns, hangs below the downward sloped shoulders, which in turn hang below the 2 right angles that form the cross. And in those simple lines, she's able to capture the agony and weariness, but also the wonder and miracle of Christ's suffering for us. So, a moment ago, we heard Zechariah chapter 8, and Annie drew a picture of that scene. In particular, she zeroed in on one particular verse. May you receive the same blessings that came to Judah and Israel. That's the verse she wants to illustrate. How would you do that? How would you draw if that was the verse you had to draw? Well, before I show you her picture, let's just give a little background on who Zechariah is and who he is talking to. Zechariah began his prophecy about 520 BC, which that date may mean nothing to you, and that's okay. But let me give you a quick recap of the century or so that preceded Zechariah. 85 years prior, 605 BC, the kingdom of Judah became a vassal of the Babylonian Empire. And what I mean by a vassal state, that meant they paid tribute to the Babylonian Empire for their protection. It's like the school bully shaking you down for lunch money so he'll protect you from all the other bullies that are out there, right? Like it was an exploitative relationship. And Judah and the king, King Jehoiakim, resented it. So after about a decade of living as a vassal of Babylonian Empire, Jehoiakim rose up in rebellion, and the Babylonians were having nothing of it. They sieged Jerusalem for 3 months, during which time Jehoiakim died, and when Jerusalem fell, they rounded up the people and took them across the desert back to Babylon to live in slavery and exile. Now, there were some Israelites who remained in Judah and Jerusalem, and so they lived continuing as a vassal for another decade, until a decade later, Jehoiakim's grandson, Zedekiah, decided he was going to try the same thing. He rose up in rebellion, and this time the Babylonians said, they're not getting the message, so we're going to come along, and not only did they take the people into exile, but they knocked down all the walls of Jerusalem, so they'd never have to lay siege to it again. They burned down the temple, and they took the people into slavery and exile. For 40 years, the Israelites lived in exile underneath Babylonian rule. After 40 years, a whole generation goes by. King Cyrus of the Persian Empire comes along, defeats the Babylonians, and King Cyrus issues an edict that says, you're free, you can go back home. And some of the Israelites do. They cross the desert, go back to their home, except it's not the joyous homecoming they expected, that the prophets declared. Instead, when they get back home, they discover ruins and rubble. The glory days are long gone. There's no walls to protect them anymore. They're raided by their neighbors. Whenever they bring in a harvest, the vultures come and take it away. It's hard, discouraging, dispiriting work. And when they look at what lays ahead of them, the next 70 years, they'll spend the time rebuilding the walls, rebuilding the temple. When they look at what's ahead, they're discouraged and exhausted. They have no hope for the future. It's into that context that Zechariah preached. Now, I don't want to make a direct parallel from what they went through to what we've gone through, but I do think the last 2 years have been an exhausting experience for so many in our world. I mean, the losses that just compounded with COVID, the challenges of social distancing, the division that has entered into our public discourse. I mean, we just feel like there's so little hope for our future. Or maybe take it off the national scale. Maybe just think about yourself personally. I know there are members of our church who've lost loved ones, Next week, we're going to celebrate All Saints Sunday and remember all those we've lost in the last year. There are people who've lost jobs, people who've lost relationships. If you've ever been in a place where you feel like your walls have been knocked down and you don't have the energy, you don't have the hope, you don't even know where to begin to rebuild. That's what the Israelites felt like. Now, this sermon, I should give you a disclaimer, or a credit, I guess. I heard it preached by a Methodist minister named David Callis, who is a minister up in Green Bay, Wisconsin. I heard him, though, in Tennessee. If you remember this past summer, I was in a pretty worn-out place myself. I was exhausted spiritually, mentally, emotionally, professionally. I felt like every week when I was preparing a sermon, I was having to dip further and further down into the well and scraping the sides to try to come up with what I felt like God was wanting me to say. And I went to our staff parish committee, and I said, I just need some time away. I got to replenish because I'm feeling dry right now. And they graciously said, take the month of July. I spent the first 2 weeks doing nothing. I mean, I was caring for my wife who had surgery, but I really, for the most part, I was resting, I was reading, I was running and reflecting. I didn't go anywhere, do anything. The third week, though, I decided to travel and go back to the camp meeting that I grew up attending. Now, if you have no idea what a camp meeting is, it's an old tradition that goes back centuries, dating back to the Second Great Awakening. And so outside my little hometown, Brownsville, Tennessee, there's a country church called Tabernacle UMC up there in the right-hand corner. And that church was planted by my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Taylor, I think 7 or 8 generations back. And around that church is a campground. Old cabins, rustic cabins like you see on the left. And what happens is 1 week every summer, descendants of great-great-great-great-grandfather Taylor all come, and we live in those cabins for a week, and we go to church 3 times a day. And it's kind of like a revival of sorts. That's what it was when it first began back in the Second Great Awakening. So that's what I kind of grew up doing. And because our camp meeting is one of the oldest in the country, it's 195 years old, about to celebrate its 200th year anniversary. Because it has a little bit of notoriety. So even though it's a small town of Brownsville, Tennessee, I grew up hearing these amazing preachers from Methodism that came and spent the week with us preaching. And one of those preachers was a man named Ellsworth Callis, who was president of Asbury Seminary. He was a fine preacher. He would come virtually every other year. I got to listen to him growing up. He was so popular that he was buried in the family graveyard there on the camp meeting grounds. And so his son, David, after Ellsworth Callis, Dr. Callis, passed away, sometime after that, David Callis began coming about every other year. But I had never heard him preach before. And I'll be honest, I was entering into worship that evening a little bit skeptical, wondering if the son would live up to the dad. So as David Callis began preaching, he began saying words that, frankly, were familiar to me, like things that I just perhaps needed to hear again. He was just talking about the blessings of God. He said, if you want to know and understand God's will, the best place is to start with God's heart, for God's will is always a reflection of God's heart. And God's heart, he proclaimed, is generous. His desire always is to give and bless his people. So God's perfect will, therefore, is to bless and restore his people. And so the story of the Bible from beginning to end is a story of God loving and blessing his people. And he says the first thing we get, that's kind of the evidence of this, is the very first thing that the serpent calls into question with Adam and Eve. Did God really say you can't eat of any fruit in the tree? The serpent whispers in Eve's ear. I mean, here Adam and Eve are surrounded by abundance, all the food, all the blessing they could possibly need or desire in their lifetime. And what does the serpent whisper to them? Oh, there's real blessing. The good stuff is behind the counter. God put it out of reach from you. If you want it, then you have to go outside of God's will, God's boundaries in order to get the good stuff. That's where the real blessing is. See, what the serpent does is he twists our view of God. Instead of being from someone who is generous to someone who is withholding from us. And Callis said that's the nature of all temptation, even today. Because if we don't understand the generosity of God, then we'll never understand his heart or his will. We'll continually think we have to go outside of God's boundaries in order to receive the blessings we really want. Because God's good and generous heart and his perfect will is always to bless his people. And then so starting from the Garden of Eden all the way to Jesus' ministry, he recounted these passages about God's blessing. To Abraham, when God calls Abraham, he says, I will bless you, and I will bless those who bless you, and I will make you a blessing unto all the nations. And then when the people come out of Egypt and they're wandering in the desert and they're complaining against God because they're sick and tired of manna, God commands the priests to pronounce blessing upon them, to recite day after day these words, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. And then Moses, when the people are about to enter into the promised land, which again is pure gift from God to them, Moses says to them, see, today I set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live loving the Lord your God, obeying him and holding fast to him. For that means life to you in length of days. And then the psalmist in Psalm 103 declares, bless the Lord, O my soul. All that is in me, bless his holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits. And then for a whole chapter of the Psalms, he recounts blessing after blessing after blessing after blessing. And you go to Jesus' ministry, which is in of itself a blessing to everyone who flocks to him. And the blessing shows up in material ways and in healings and people being liberated and set free. And his most famous Sermon on the Mount, what does Jesus do? He begins it with blessings. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart and the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted. Blessed, 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 blessed. God's generous heart and his perfect will from beginning to end is to bless his people. So after Cal has kind of went through that salvation history, now we are well anchored in that, and we come back to Zechariah chapter 8. And we remember that this is a time where people were very much in doubt of God's blessings. Because when they looked out at the world in front of them, they saw brownness and rubble and destruction. They saw a lot of back-breaking work ahead of them, and they were wondering where God is. Why has he withheld his blessings? And so Zechariah holds up a picture in front of them. He says, I tell you, God wants to bless you. And he says the people are going to plant their crops in peace, and their vines will bear grapes. There will be plenty of rain. I will give these blessings to my people. And then I love verse 13. There's this reversal that happens. He says in verse 13, he says, in the past, foreigners would curse one another by saying, may the same disasters fall on you that fell on Judah and Israel. Like that's how bad it was that they would curse, may you be like Judah and Israel. He says, but the time is coming, I tell you, when those fortunes will be reversed so that those same foreigners will say to one another, may you receive the same blessings that came to Judah and Israel. That's how rich and blessed you'll be, that your name will be used as a blessing for others. Now I remind you, that's the verse that Annie Valaton chose to illustrate. May you receive the same blessings as Judah and Israel. So this is her picture. What do you see? It's a picture of a bountiful harvest, a bumper crop. Because the biblical society was an agricultural society. And this is how they understood God's blessings. rain and grain and fertility and plenty, right? It's a picture of God's blessings. But now let me ask you this. And this is up to this point and through David Callis' sermon, I was like, I was with him. I was like, I've heard it all before though. And here was the twist. He asked the question, he says, if I didn't tell you that's a picture of blessing, if you looked at this picture completely divorced from the context that I've given you, what would you see? What does it look like? What are the people doing? They're working. They're cutting, they're binding, they're hauling grain. There's a lot of work. With an abundant harvest comes a lot of work to do. And Callis asked this simple question. Isn't it amazing to think that God's abundant harvest and his blessing often involves a lot of work? That's not the way we picture blessedness in our culture. Like I think about Corona commercials, right? There are always pictures of people on the beach, on a hammock with a drink in their hands, and they're saying, find your beach, #blessed. This is how we describe blessing, but that's not the picture of blessing in the biblical record. This is the picture. The picture of blessing in the Bible is the blessing of fruitful labor. And that's not to say that we earn God's blessing, and I'm not talking about prosperity gospel where God makes us rich so we can bless others. And remember, Jesus' blessings, his benedictions, his beatitudes were not about material wealth. It's rather the point that the harvest of God's blessing often requires a lot of work and effort from us to be good stewards of it. David Callis tells the story of a tree. It was in his yard in Green Bay. He said, it's the first time I've ever had a tree that bore fruit. And so I was trying to be a good caretaker for this tree. And he said, I noticed something, that early in the season, when it was late spring, early summer, and when I would mow the grass beneath the tree, it was relatively easy. Like I could just kind of walk right underneath. But as the season progressed, especially towards, once we got into fall, those branches, the lower branches of the tree would start to lower and lower and lower to the point where I had to crane and stretch and contort myself into odd positions just to get the lawnmower underneath the tree. What was causing those branches to get lower and lower and lower? Fruit. He said if you actually lifted the branches, you could feel how heavy the weight of those apples were. And so he says, sometimes our lives are heavy laden with the fruit that God provides. And he had me right there with that word, heavy laden. That's how I felt. But I never stopped to consider that the things that were weighing me down might also be the blessings of God. We got a new puppy about a month ago. Cute little guy. 4 months old, Sammy. We got him at the rescue boutique here in town. And he's a great little puppy. He is a lot of work. He is exhausting. I mean, just boundless energy. I'm the one who typically gets up with him in the middle of the night when he needs to go to the bathroom because he hasn't figured out how to make it through the night. And so he'll hop on my chest and lick my face, and I know that means let's go. So I take him out, and he chews stuff all the time, right? Like, he just constantly is chewing, and sometimes it's just stuff that we have to clean up, that stuff. But sometimes it's stuff that you can't repair. Like he loves the carpet on our stairs, and sometimes there's a balding spot already. We're like, no, And so I find myself complaining about this little puppy that we got, right? When David Callis told the story, he told the story of a woman who came into his office one day, was very upset, and in the center of her complaint was her baby had just thrown up on her brand new couch. And he listened for a while, and then he stopped her and says, well, I just want to point out, you have a baby and you have a couch. And how many people in the world would love and celebrate those blessings? And I thought of that, and I thought, I have a puppy, and I have stairs. I have a house big enough to have stairs. Like, who am I to be complaining? How many times Do you and I complain about something that someone else in the world would give anything to have? I mean, maybe you're crushed right now because you have a big mortgage and car payments and student loans, and the weight of all those things is heavy. But I would also point out that you have a house and a car and an education, and there are blessings in those things. Maybe you have a big job with lots of responsibilities that are weighing you down. Maybe you're caring for someone, a loved one, a spouse or a parent. Maybe you're driving your kids all over creation for all the activities they have to do. Maybe your calendar is so full of activities you don't know how you're going to accomplish it all. Maybe you have phone calls you need to make, people that you've lost touch with and you know you need to reconnect. And I would just say to you, for whatever burdens you might list, it might also be true that you got a lot of apples. You have a lot of fruit that God has given. David Callis said one sentence that I went home and I wrote in my journal that night. He said, I have to be careful when I complain because it might just be that I'm lamenting the harvest of God in my life. And you ever been in a church and you feel like a message is directed right at you? Like I know David had no idea who I was or why, that I'd be sitting in the pews, and yet I felt like he was talking directly to me. Because I was tired leading this big church, and I thought, how many people would love to be the pastor of Zionsville United Methodist Church? How many people would love to live in this great community? How many people? I'm lamenting the harvest of God in my life. But as I walk around Zionsville and I consider my neighbors, when I talk to my parishioners, I think it's not just a message that was meant for me. I think it's a message that's meant for us. Because we live in a place where the bounty, the harvest of God is evident. But how many of us are heavy laden? And this isn't to say if you are feeling heavy laden that you don't have a right to feel that way. I'm not trying to diminish or silver line the burdens that you carry. I am simply asking you to consider, within the burdens that you carry, is there also a hidden blessing? Because it changes how we carry our burdens when we can see the blessing, the harvest that they're connected to. In coming weeks, we're going to be talking, this is going to be our theme for the next month, right? And in coming weeks, we'll talk about, sometimes we're overburdened because we've been unable to say no. Sometimes we've been overburdened because we've forgotten how to rest. Or sometimes we're overburdened because we're so conscious of protecting our blessings, we've forgotten how to share them, right? And so in coming weeks, we're going to keep unpacking this because I do think God calls us to be good stewards of the harvest that he has provided. But today, I simply want you to know and remember one thing, that the generous heart of God and the perfect will of God is to bless you. And you don't have to go outside the boundaries and limits that God has given you in order to find other blessings. You don't have to carry your burdens on your own. Remember that Jesus said, "Come to me, all ye who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." The Message translation says, "Come to me and I will teach you the unforced rhythms of grace." That's what we're going to learn together. The unforced rhythms of grace. So for right now, I just want you to take that picture of Annie Volaton. And I want you to imagine yourself, place yourself in that scene. And I want to say, yes, there's work to do. And the work is heavy, and the work is hard. But there are blessings to be found in it. And there is always, always, always joy in the harvest. Amen.